Tonight, I'm going to jump right into the stories. There are a couple of sensitive topics covered this evening, so listener discretion is advised. Thanks as always to the writers of tonight's tales. You can find more info and their links below. Have a spooky night, everyone. I think my cat belongs to the devil. It all started with a meow. It was just barely audible over the bustle of the street. The alley was narrow, with dumpsters and trash along its walls. The smell wafted past me, causing my nose to scrunch up in disgust. I was about to keep walking when I heard it again. It was soft and weak. Lifting my jacket to cover my nose, I disappeared down the alley. Stepping carefully to avoid the noxious gunk scattered on the ground, I peered around. The trash was piled high, and the dumpsters were overflowing with crap. There was no movement, and the honking from cars on the street made it harder to hear. I strained, trying to hear anything. A small movement caught my eye, and I turned to face a pile. Garbage bags and boxes were stacked against the dumpster, threatening to topple over at the slightest disturbance. There it was again, the softest cry for help. Holding my breath, I carefully removed the bags and boxes, one by one, being careful to avoid getting any unknown substances on my hands. There, hidden underneath an empty box of ramen, was a small orange kitten. It shivered and jumped at the sight of me, backing up against the garbage. I slowed my movements, carefully setting the box of ramen to the side. I knelt slowly and offered my hand. The little thing meowed again, sniffing the air. It was covered in fleas and greatly malnourished. My heart ached for the poor creature, but I stayed still, not wanting to scare it off. Softly, I said, "It's all right, baby. I won't hurt you. Let me help." Its ears twitched, and it took a hesitant step towards me. I smiled as it approached. It sniffed my hand before pushing its face against it. I could feel it purring, and I gently lifted it up. It had beautiful blue eyes and a little white spot in the middle of its forehead. I unzipped my jacket and tucked him inside, cradling him against my chest. It purred louder and nestled its way against my collarbone. With him safely stored, I made my way home. I decided to name him Teacup, as he always loved crawling into my mugs as I was about to make some tea. He was given a nice warm bath to rid him of the fleas, and a small saucer of milk. The vet said that I had found him just in time. Another day or two and he would have been a goner. His fleas and worms were treated, and I pampered him with all of the things a little kitty could desire. As he grew bigger, I noticed that the little spot on his forehead began to resemble an upside-down cross. He was always sweet and kind to me, but hated strangers. Anyone, and I mean anyone, who went near him was met by hissing and bristling of fur. Other than that, he was a perfectly behaved cat. Then, well, something very, very strange happened. It was last week. I had just gotten home from work and was greeted by Teacup at the front door. He meowed happily and extended his head out for pats. Just as I was about to pet him, a shove hit me hard from behind. I was sent sprawling into my apartment, knocking over a potted plant on my descent. When my head made contact with the floor, everything went black. I awoke with a start, feeling a stinging pain across my cheek. I groaned and tried to rub the sore spot. My hands and feet were bound, and it was then that I remembered. My eyes shot open, and I looked panickedly around the room. I had been tied to the bed and was now only wearing my bra and underwear. I whimpered and pulled at my restraints. "Easy there, Missy. There's no way out of those," a voice said from the foot of my bed. I strained my eyes and could make out the silhouette of a man. He was dressed in all dark clothing and had some sort of mask on his face, but I could see the bright, piercing green eyes glaring down at me. They were full of hunger and anticipation. Please don't hurt me," I choked out, feeling tears starting to well up in my eyes. He laughed at this and ran a finger around my left ankle. "Oh, doll, that will come later." He started to crawl over the bed, over me. I screamed and cried, pulling harder as I tried to get away. I felt his rough, wet tongue run across my stomach, and I screamed. Suddenly, the man was thrown off of me and against the bedroom wall. He landed in a pile and groaned. I stared wide-eyed, barely able to keep my breathing calm. A hand gently touched my shoulder, and I let out a squeal of fright. Standing to the side of my bed was another man. This one was finely dressed in a white suit with a red undershirt. His hair was black and slick. His eyes were a sparkling gray, and stubble grew across his chiseled chin. He smiled softly at me and undid my restraint. Quickly, I pulled and started undoing my bonds, eyes bouncing back and forth between the two strangers in my bedroom. Teacup came running into the room, having wedged open the bedroom door. He made a beeline for the well-dressed stranger, and I found myself yelling, "Teacup, stop!" The little cat ignored me and started wrapping himself around the stranger's legs, purring louder than I've ever heard him before. The man bent over and ran his fingers delicately over the cat's head. "But he doesn't like—" The stranger cut me off, finishing my sentence. "Strangers, yes, he never did like new people," the man chuckled and lifted up the cat. I heard a groan to my left and jumped at the sound. The other man was slowly getting to his feet, rubbing his head. The other hand reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. I quickly darted from the bed, but was met by the man in white. He gently placed Teacup in my arms and gave the cat one more pet. Now, Reggie, I wasn't supposed to be seeing you for another year, but," he tisked, sucking in air as he wiggled his finger at the man, "this fine lady is taking care of my little fluffykins, and I can't have you killing her." With inhuman speed, the man in white was across the room and lifting the attacker by the neck. He silenced a yelp as he squeezed harder. The knife clattered to the floor. I stood, wide-eyed, watching the scene. Without realizing it, I was stroking underneath Teacup's neck, who purred in agreement. My savior lifted up the man and gazed up at him. The attacker squirmed and beat at his arms, his face turning red and purple. The man who saved me looked back over his shoulder at me and gave me a dazzling smile. "I'll be seeing you here again soon, and please, I would be very grateful if you removed that cross from your wall before then, or at the very least, turn it upside down." With that, they vanished. A burst of hot air blew past me, and I stumbled a bit. The room was now silent and empty. My knees buckled, and I fell against the wall. Teacup looked up at me with his big blue eyes, and for a second, just 1 second, they seemed to glow red. A demon in disguise. Bill and Nancy had a painful history of trying for a baby. The devastation from the miscarriages was taking its toll, and after the 5th, hope had all but died. A chance encounter at her job as a cleaner at the local hospital created a chance for the couple to foster a young girl named Cindy. The young girl came with a question mark. No one knew anything about her, apart from her name. She turned up at the hospital alone, with burns on her hands and not saying a word. Bill was at home, waiting for Nancy to bring the mysterious girl home from the hospital. The struggling writer spent his days at home, trying to write the next great novel. Bill was still dreaming of success, a promise he had made to Nancy the night they fell in love. An awkward silence filled the car on the drive back from the hospital. The frightened girl seemed lost in her trauma. Her eyes darted back and forth as her fragile mind tried to make sense of her new surroundings. Nancy's eyes scanned every detail of the young girl's face as she watched from her rearview mirror. "I hope you'll like your room, sweetie." Nancy waited for a response, but Cindy just stayed focused on her bandaged hands. Bill stood at the door as the car pulled into the driveway. The couple's dog, Prince, stood wagging its tail. Nancy couldn't wait to introduce the girl to her husband. "You'll like Bill. He's just a big kid at heart." She jumped from the car and embraced her husband. "How is she? Did you have a nice talk on the way here?" asked Bill. "She hasn't said much. She seems so fragile and lost, and I hate to think what could have happened to her." Cindy nervously climbed from the back seat of the car as the dog ran over to her. Prince yelped with excitement and began sniffing the girl. His excitement turned to nervous apprehension as his tail retreated between his legs. Bill and Nancy glanced at each other as the dog began growling and backing away from Cindy. "That's strange," whispered Bill. The couple's modest 3-bedroom house was desperate to be filled with the sound of children. The quiet nights spent watching telly alone when Bill was out or in his study only intensified Nancy's loneliness. Nancy tried showing Cindy around the house, but couldn't escape the feeling of disappointment towards her demeanor. It wasn't the fairy tale she had imagined for all those years, but she was determined to make it work. The aroma of garlic filled the house as Bill cooked his famous bolognese sauce. Cindy kept close to Nancy and would shadow her whenever Bill was in the room. Even though the frightened girl didn't talk, Nancy still felt a strange bond between them. Bill was busy setting the table when Nancy got a text on her phone. "I need to head back to the hospital. Do you mind watching her?" A look of contempt shot across Bill's face. "Do I have to? I mean, is it a good idea to be leaving her alone with me?" "Don't be silly. It will give you two a chance to get to know each other." As Nancy grabbed her keys to leave, Cindy suddenly became terrified at the thought of being alone with Bill. She wrapped her arms around her waist, gripping it like a vice. A warm tingle crept up Nancy's back. She never felt needed like this before, not even by her husband. The tighter the girl squeezed, the harder she fell. She knelt and parted Cindy's long blonde hair from her face. "I promise I'll be right back. You're perfectly safe with Bill, and he makes a mean spaghetti," she said with a motherly glint in her eye. "Don't forget about my garlic bread," laughed Bill. Cindy sat with her gaze fixated on the table and her face buried behind a mound of blonde hair. The awkward silence was palpable. Bill tried his best to break the ice, but Cindy didn't even look up from the empty plate. The warm smell of food permeated through the air as he set the table. "We have one rule here in this house. You help yourself." Bill waited for a response, but Cindy didn't even flinch. "You're a strange one, aren't you? Do you ever talk, or is this some edgy preteen stuff?" Bill's gaze fixated on the girl as he continued to shovel food into his mouth. "Do you want to know a secret? I never wanted kids. To be honest, I don't even like kids." Cindy just sat there as if the words went over her head. Bill finished the last of his dinner and put his plate in the sink. "When you're ready to eat, you know what to do. I'm going to my study to get some work done. Do you understand what I'm saying?" he said with a condescending tone. The tranquility of Bill's study was a source of pride for him. The thought of kids coming in and ruining his Zen palace was something that scared the life out of him. He went along with his wife's fantasy of having the American family for the sake of his own peace. He sat at his desk with the glow of the laptop screen lighting up the room. He typed monotonously, with the click-clacking sound of his keyboard suddenly interrupted by the distressed yelping sound made by the dog. Bill bolted from his study and ran to the kitchen. Bill was struck with a sense of terror when he entered the kitchen to find blood smeared all over the floor. He frantically began searching the house for any signs of the dog. Cindy stood in the living room, silently staring at a picture of the happy couple. "What did you do to my dog? I knew this was a big mistake. When Nancy gets back, you're gone, Missy." Cindy didn't move and stood staring at the picture hanging on the wall. "Why are you just standing there? Say something, you freak." "What the hell is going on here?" said a voice from the door of the living room. Bill turned to see Nancy shooting daggers in his direction. I think she hurt the dog. There's blood on the floor in the kitchen. I'm not making this up." Nancy disappeared, only to return with the blood on her hands. She looked at Bill before licking it from her fingers. "It's the sauce, you idiot." Bill's face turned scarlet red. I heard the dog screaming, and now he's gone. How do you explain that?" Nancy rolled her eyes. "He'll turn up. You're overreacting." "We'll talk about this later," shouted Bill as he stormed away. Nancy wasn't keen to talk or even argue with her husband. She saw a side of him she never saw before, and wasn't sure what to make of it. Bill paced their bedroom while badgering Nancy about the little girl. "I'm not getting into this with you. Now drop it. I'm going to sleep," shouted Nancy. Nancy tossed and turned all night as terrifying visions of Cindy screaming as the house went up in flames invaded her dreams. Suddenly, she was jolted from her sleep as a blood-curdling scream filled the house. She roused Bill from his sleep. "Bill, I need you to go and see if Cindy's all right." Bill jumped from the bed to go and investigate, while Nancy nervously hid behind her blanket. What felt like hours passed before the sound of the screaming stopped. Suddenly, Bill shouted for his wife. Pictures of the couple that proudly hung on the walls now littered the floor. She followed the sound of her husband's voice to find him standing amongst the debris of his ransacked study. "Look what she did to my study. Do you believe me now when I tell you she's broken?" "How do you know it was Cindy?" Bill shot Nancy a look. "Look around. The freak cut me out of all the pictures." Nancy ran to the bedroom Cindy was sleeping in to find her still in bed. She felt like she was going crazy and knew her husband was right about her, but as she watched the little girl sleep, she couldn't escape the need to protect her. Nancy woke to the sound of silence. Bill's side of the bed was cold, and for the first time she felt the cold sting of a loveless marriage. Nancy came down to the kitchen to find Cindy already sitting at the table. "We need to talk about what happened last night." Cindy continued to sit there in silence. "You gave us a real scare last night, Sweet Pea." A familiar feeling started to creep in. It was a feeling she only reserved for Bill when she got stuck at the hospital for a 12-hour shift. "If this is going to work, you have to talk to me." The little girl brushed the long blonde hair from her face and smiled at Nancy. She was stunned as she watched the little girl stand up and walk out of the kitchen. The little girl led Nancy to Bill's locked study. "We can't go in there. You already got me into a lot of trouble." Cindy wasn't taking no for an answer and stood there smiling. "He keeps the door locked. What am I supposed to do?" As the words left her mouth, the sound of twisting metal and a loud click echoed around the house. Nancy nervously turned the doorknob to the study. Her knees felt weak as she slowly opened the door. She stepped inside to find Bill had already cleaned the room. Everything was back in its place, apart from the pictures he dumped in the bin. Nancy's eyes scanned the room. A little voice in her head was telling her something was off. Suddenly, something caught her attention. Bill was always the worst at cleaning, she thought, as she spotted the corner of a brown envelope sticking out from under his desk. Nancy felt a lump in her throat. Why was a doctor sending Bill letters? She thought to herself. She suddenly felt the room get smaller as she read further down the letter. Anger built up inside every time she read the word vasectomy. She fell to her knees. Tears streamed down her face. She struggled to get her breath as she finished the letter. He had lied to her for years, making her think she was the reason they couldn't have kids. Suddenly, her stomach felt barren from the thought of being denied something she craved for so long. She gathered what strength she could and picked herself off the ground. Nancy looked around the room to find Cindy gone. She ran throughout the house calling for her, but couldn't find any trace. Panic set in when she realized she was alone in the house. The warm, pleasant feeling from the girl's presence was gone and replaced by a dreadful chill. Nancy searched everywhere, and as the sun began to set, she started to fear the worst. Nancy heard the front door open, and for a moment she thought it was Cindy. Bill arrived back with flowers and chocolate, hoping to make it up with his wife. "Are you all right? Where's the freak gone?" Nancy couldn't hide her hatred for her husband. "Don't you dare talk about her like that." A look of confusion shot across Bill's face. "I'm not the one who trashed our house." "Our house. This is my house. I pay for everything. You're nothing but a bad memory in this house." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Nancy took a deep breath as she pulled the brown envelope from her back pocket. Bill's face went blood red when he saw the letter. "How is that even possible? I burnt that in a fire months ago." A feeling of betrayal washed over her, and tears began flowing down her cheeks. "I want you gone this second. There's nothing here for you. Get your shit and get out." Bill laughed into his wife's face. "I ain't going nowhere. If you think I'm going to let you ruin what I built up here, you got another thing coming." Bill's face twisted with rage. Spit spewed from his mouth as he raved and ranted at his wife. Nancy had never seen this side of him and was shockingly surprised at how fast his demeanor changed. He paced the room with his brain in overdrive as he planned his next move. "You need to calm down. If you leave now, we can talk about this tomorrow." Bill looked at Nancy with a blank, soulless stare. "I did love you, which will make what I do next all the bit harder." He grabbed Nancy by the hair and pulled her to the ground. He began to rain blows down on Nancy's head. She tried to fight back, but he was too strong for her. She screamed out for help as he dragged her around the living room. As Nancy struggled for her life, Cindy suddenly appeared in the doorway to the living room. "I thought that freak left." Bill's attention focused on the little girl. Nancy saw a chance of escape and made a run for the kitchen. Nancy grabbed a kitchen knife that someone had conveniently left on the kitchen table. She tried to make a run for the front door, but found Bill blocking her way. She charged at him with the knife raised before plunging it into his shoulder, knocking him to the ground. "Come up here, Nancy. You'll be safe with us." Nancy followed the sweet sound of the little girl's voice. Bill picked himself up from the ground and armed himself with the knife he pulled from his shoulder. He ran up the stairs after his wife, blinded with rage. Nancy ran towards Cindy, who had her arms outstretched, waiting to embrace her. Bill made it to the top of the stairs, his eyes filled with murderous intent. As he made a go for Nancy, their dog Prince came bounding out of one of the bedrooms. He made a jump for Bill's throat and knocked him back down the stairs. Bill laid at the end of the stairs, dead, while Nancy embraced Cindy. A sense of peace washed over Nancy as she squeezed her tight, but by the time she opened her eyes, the little girl was gone. Months went by, and Nancy was starting to rebuild her life. Nobody believed her about the little girl, but Nancy could still smell her. She exhausted all avenues in her search. She was about to give up hope of finding her until she received a phone call from one of the officers looking into her case. Nancy was surprised by the officer's friendly tone. "Hi, Nancy. I have to inform you that we couldn't locate the girl by that name. We did find someone who matched her description. The girl's name was Jade." Nancy's heart sank. "What do you mean, was?" "See, that's the strange thing. The girl we found died in a house fire a few months ago. The investigators looking into it declared it a tragic accident, but there's one detail they couldn't get their heads around. When they found the girl's body, the only part of her that got burned was her hands. It would have made sense, only she was clutching a brown envelope that was in perfect condition." The crushed woman. The falling of leaves, the crisp chill in the air, sweet apples and carving pumpkins. Fall is by far the best season. Sweaters are out and hot chocolate is brewed. There is nothing I don't like about autumn, other than the crushed woman. There is a legend in my town, started in the 70s or 80s, not really sure when. It all starts with a woman. She doesn't have a name, and I'm not sure she was ever given one. She's always gone by the crushed woman. She was in her 20s and was rumored to once be very beautiful. Her hair was like autumn leaves, changing from orange to brown to red in certain lighting. Her eyes were a honey brown and always held a sparkle. Her nose was perky and her lips were curved and delicate. She was stunning. Then she met a man, a stranger, someone who had never been seen around town before. His appearance changes from story to story, but there is always one thing that stays the same: his smile. His teeth were said to be such a glistening white that they would shine in the sun. And just that alone is enough to understand why the woman fell for him the way she did. They planned to elope, ditch town, and leave her overbearing parents behind. And so, one warm fall evening, the woman packed her bags and was never seen again. Or better said, she was never seen alive again. Her body was found buried under a pile of freshly fallen leaves. Her hair had been torn out in places, her eyelids were sliced off, and her lips were sewn together. Her limbs were bent in abnormal directions. Her organs were strewn around her body, as if they had been squeezed out, escaping from any opening they could. She was naked, torn apart, and left to rot. Her lover was never found, and her parents buried her in a far corner of the cemetery, underneath a great oak tree, which every fall would shed its decaying leaves and cover the woman's headstone. It wouldn't be a legend, though, if something haunting didn't happen after her death. Every autumn since the woman was discovered and buried, it is said that her spirit awakens and roams the streets. Her ghostly form still appears like it did when she was found. Her limbs move in wrong directions, and her body jerks along while her bones snap with every step. Her hair is matted, with ripped leaves tangling throughout. Her lips are swollen and red, and they struggle against the wire that holds them shut. Her eyes, wide, bloody, and full of hate. She appears on chilly nights when the fallen leaves litter the ground underfoot. If you walk alone on nights like this, you can hear the clear crackling sound of the leaves crunching under your feet. But if you listen closely, you can hear the sounds of another set of feet. These steps hesitate and stomp upon the dead plant matter, crunching the leaves with every step. They jerk and get closer as you walk. No matter how fast you go, she will always catch up. And if she catches you, well, let's just say your corpse won't be a pretty sight. The only way to keep her from getting you is to stop and let her pass. She'll creep up slowly, and it'll feel like she is right behind you. She is. She'll stay behind you for what will feel like hours. Finally, she'll move around you and slowly make her way up the street. You cannot move until she is out of sight. If she hears you, she'll come back, and it's much harder to fool her twice. She follows the sound of crushed leaves, searching for the man who did this to her. If you stop, the only steps will now be hers. Silence is key, and you must wait for her to leave. She is forever walking, forever following the last sound she ever heard, as she was left on that forest floor. She is broken, she is tattered, she is cursed. She is crushed, just like the autumn leaves. Living Nightmare. This is a true story. I woke up, lying in a cold sense of bewilderment, staring at the flat white ceiling above me as the warm wind screeched at the window. All in the world seemed right, but there was most certainly something wrong. For a moment, I gathered my senses. Lying perfectly still, I began taking mental notes on my surroundings. The thin green blanket lay across my bare chest, the little red light of my TV beaming into my eyes, and my roommate snoring like a train in the opposite corner of the dorm. Something just wasn't right about tonight. My blue eyes rolled restlessly, cautiously, searching through shadows for something that they truly did not want to see. My eyes pulled towards the deeper portions of the room. All the inner voices of my body begged and screamed for them to stop, but they did not. The deeper portions of the dorm room were always thickly shrouded in the blackest of shadows. My roommate never closed the bathroom door unless he was in there using it, a habit that was greatly annoying because of the constant dripping of our showerhead and a strange fear of seeing a shadow peek out at me. As I stared at the bathroom opening, it dawned on me that shadow people were always like that weird character on the early Mortal Kombat games. I've yet to see one, though, where the apparitions called out, "Toasty!" when they looked towards the camera. The thought made me laugh, a subtle calm before all my nerves would explode in absolute terror. My wandering eyes continued on their meandering search of the darkest portions of our dorm room. The heavy doorway sat about an inch or two above the floor. The main hallway sat right on the opposite side. There was always the pale white glow of the lights slipping its fingers into our room through the narrow slit beneath the door, and that's exactly where it stood. I didn't recognize the form of a person right away. Matter of fact, it took me a second to really realize that anything was there at all. The white glow of the hall lights shined through the crack between the bottom of the door and the floor, but two dark legs blocked out the center portion of the light. Somehow, I knew that it, too, knew that I had seen it. I couldn't identify the shape of the body, but my voice crashed unwaveringly into the bottom of my throat. I couldn't utter a sound. In a flash, the dark mass dashed straight to the side of my bed. I hollered out for help, but my cries were only resounding in my own head. My roommate slept peacefully, about 20 feet from me, but I felt the heavy weight of a person climb on top of me. To this day, my lower throat still heaves in fear at remembering that night. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The distinct feeling of two thumbs pressing down into my skin, but no one there at all, still sends shudders through my body. This was it. Death had come. I fought it, but even though I'm as built as a gold miner, there was no escaping the paranormal murderer. Giving up and feeling my strength fading, I settled my nerves and did the only thing I could think of doing. I prayed. "Our Father, who art in heaven," was all the words that needed to be said. In a moment that was as brief as a lightning strike, everything went away. Such calm, such peace that I immediately fell back to sleep. In the morning, I woke up and looked around. There was nothing amiss, nothing that even indicated that I had almost been killed by a ghost, or something, just 5 hours before. I asked my roommate if he had heard anything, but he said that he had been so knocked out that a cannon shot wouldn't even have awakened him. I was so distraught by what had happened that I even called a recently ex-girlfriend just so that I could have someone to tell the story to. For years, I kept what happened to me that night stored away. I never understood it, and I can't rightly say that I believe my convictions of it today. Through faith, we are taught that there is good and evil. Through science, we are told there is only fear and the imagination. Sleep paralysis is what everyone says. It's more of a living nightmare to me. So, sleep sweet, my friends. I hope it doesn't happen to you.